All right. Hey, everybody. This is Katrina Kibben, not Ryan Leary, and you are on Recruiting Live. So, before I introduce my awesome guest for the day, I want to make sure if everyone can see our cameras, just let us know if you can type a question in, because that's what Recruiting Live is all about. It's about you actually being involved. This is not a webinar, so we're not going to present information that we've prepared. You're not going to see slides. You are just going to listen to us to have a conversation about really nerdy recruiting and sourcing information, which is what we were actually, we're a couple minutes late because we were already nerding out. So let's start by introducing my guest for today, Mike Wolford. Mike, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background and the companies you've worked for?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on, and I'm excited to be with you guys today, and very grateful for the opportunity to talk to my fellow nerds. A little background about me. I started my career as a staffing agency recruiter. I spent a number of years as an agency headhunter recruiter in accounting and finance. I have been a corporate recruiter, an IT recruiter. I've been a sourcer. I've been a recruiting manager, and now I'm a sourcing manager for Hudson RPO. So right now I have about a dozen different accounts in North America that me and my team provide sourcing support for. I've written a couple of books. I wrote, the first one was about, it's called Becoming the Silver Bullet. It's very specifically for brand new recruiters who are just getting into our business, and it's an introduction to the tools of our trade, how to go about recruiting, how to come up with a recruiting plan. I remember when I got into the business, they were like, here's a login to Monster, go find AP clerks. And there's a lot more to it than that. So I wanted to be able to contribute to newer recruiters entering our business. I've written for SourceCon. I wrote for SourceCon for about a year, and now I also write for Recruiting Daily.
Yeah, and Animal just asked, where would people find your books if anyone's interested in finding them?
Oh, yeah, great question. Thanks, Animal. It is on Amazon. There's an ebook, and actually there should be an option now to print it, and it's print on demand.
Awesome. All right. So just go on Amazon, search for Mike Wolford, and his stuff will pop up. All right.
And
So ideally, right? That's how that'll work. Derek says they're great reads. So I would encourage anybody on the line to make sure and check those out. So what we were talking about right before we jumped on the call was this predictive talent pooling that you're working on. Because you said, you're working across a lot of different industries. And I know that a lot of people on this call are hyper specialized. So not being hyper specialized, I imagine you have to do a little more work on the data side to actually understand your group. So can you tell people what predictive talent pooling is and how you're using it now?
sure. So predictive talent pooling, the very first thing we're doing is we're mapping out the talent pools. The nice thing about having a dedicated sourcing team is we have the time to go out and identify our talent pools. So pharmacy salespeople or digital media planners or digital media buyers in Chicago, right? Well, the very first thing we do is we go out and we try and identify as many of them as possible. So we're looking at the total number of the talent pool approximately, as much as we can find. After that, we start monitoring them for job-seeking behaviors. There's been other tools that have tried to do this in the past. If some of us remember Radar on like Bullhorn Reach, basically it would take data points like if somebody updates their LinkedIn profile, right, it would alert you. That could be a leading indicator that somebody's about to look for a job. Also, if they put out on their Twitter, I hate my job, right? Like, suspicious that they might be exhibiting some job-seeking behavior. So, first we identify them, and then we go out and we look at their, publicly available data to try and monitor their job-seeking behavior. The advantage there is, we are able to identify people in other markets. So, we're looking for somebody in New York, but somebody in Chicago is a digital media planner, and we're pretty sure they're looking. We'll go ahead and approach them and say, hey, we have an opportunity, it's in New York. And while they may not have considered that while they're passively looking, if they're actively looking for a job, they may now actually be open to that. So it gives us an advantage there. And also we get a leading indicator that they're exploring. So maybe they're going online and they're looking at jobs, but they're not applying. It tips their hand a little bit, and so we'll approach those people first and see if they're interested in making a move. So typically the sourcing team, we're talking about outbound recruiting here, obviously, is where it's applicable. The other thing I think we found that's really interesting is what we would expect to be true isn't necessarily true. We were talking, before we got on. Anecdotally, when you talk to recruiters in the pharmacy space, they talk about recruiting salespeople. They're like, salespeople are always looking for a job. They will always move. But we're looking at about 6,500 pharmacy salespeople across the country. We're looking at their job-seeking behavior, and as a group, it's actually lower than other groups of professionals. Which, if you just take in the anecdotal stories, you would get one point of view. But if you actually look at the data, we were really surprised to see that actually pharmacy salespeople aren't as engaged in career changes we would expect.
Yeah. And it's probably part of our bias too, looking at salespeople, just thinking like they're very transitory, right? They'll move on from thing to thing. But as your data is showing, that's not the case. So, of course, we already have a few questions coming in. Levy's like, or they tweet, my boss is an asshat. That's a good indicator as well.
Yes.
And so beyond LinkedIn, this is a question from Alan, where do you look for your base data sets to kind of start this analysis?
Good question. So yeah, LinkedIn's obviously got a huge database, and it's likely to get bigger. I think actually Microsoft is kind of a good thing for LinkedIn. But there we also, yeah. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But besides that, we'll look at Zoom Info. We'll look at Indeed. We actually have Profit. So on the back end, Profit, when we go in through Indeed and we're sorting through there, it'll bring us contact information. And then I try and wash it through Access to look for duplicates. I used to have a very passing knowledge of Access, but it's getting a little bit better about scrubbing data. So, but basically, we're looking for first name, last name, email, phone, some sort of contact, and then some sort of social profile to track. So, be it their Twitter profile, their LinkedIn, their Google Plus, something like that kind of puts a pin in the activity. A lot of the aggregators work that way too, right? Profit will look on somebody's Twitter or LinkedIn, and then it'll go out to the web and aggregate the data. We're doing something similar, except instead of looking for resumes, we're looking for job-seeking behaviors.
Got it. So Animal asked, what percent in your talent pool are putting out these indicators? Is that kind of your first threshold for even contacting?
So when our sourcers log in, it updates every day, and it takes an aggregate moving score. So the scores go between 4 and 72. So 72 is they're very actively looking.
Right.
So every activity is assigned a certain amount of points over a certain amount of time. So when we log in the morning, yeah, we'll be looking at who's actively looking and then who's exploring, and that'll be really the recruiter preference and about who they approach first. Some recruiters don't want active candidates. Some recruiters want to get at people who are about to start looking. But to answer the question, it's really about 4 to 5% of the people are looking actively at any one time, and then probably another 4 or 5% are exploring at any one time, which is about 10%, which anecdotally matches up to what we typically hear about 10 to 13% of the job market's available at any time. I think it's probably a little lower than that. I think it's closer to 10%, but
Right.
the data
It's also the
seems...
definition of available, right? What's
Yeah.
available and how, are they in a role available, out of a role available, etc. Yeah.
So the data actually looks pretty good. And the other nice thing we do is we're able to do regression testing. So we go back and look and see if the people that showed up on our radar as active, did they actually change their jobs? we do samples of it, and it's not universal. And I think that shows actually accuracy in the data because we've all had it happen. We have somebody who's very actively interviewing, and then they either call it off or they take a counter, right, or they stay. So it's not 100%. It never will be because we're dealing with people. But it does really help give our sourcers or our outbound recruiters an advantage on response rates, because that's really what we're looking to gain. We're trying to gain efficiencies. And we talk about it all the time in recruiting, right? Like I wrote for Recruiting Daily about killing spam, and we want to do that because we're kind of burning down the forest we're trying to hunt in with it.
Yeah.
And
I like that. Burning down the forest you're trying to hunt in. That's exactly what people are doing.
That's what we're doing. And so it's one thing to teach your recruiters to do that, but at scale, it's another thing to look at a technology that says, okay, instead of blasting out 100 people and getting 5 responses, why don't you guys target these 10 people and get 3 responses? And even if I'm not upping their game, which is ultimately my goal, but even if I can't up their game and they still send the same ridiculous email, at least now I'm leveraging technology to increase my response rates across the board. And that's really where the big win comes in for us as sourcers, outbound recruiters. From a marketing standpoint, though, it also really gives us good historical data, right? We're labeled to go back over time and look at trends and see if they're really, some of us wouldn't be surprised. I recruited out of Big Four for a number of years. You're really not surprised to see a spike in job-seeking activity April 16th. You wouldn't be surprised by that, but to go back through the data and look and see, is it really April 16th that the spike begins, or is it in September after the bonus gets paid and they're looking down the barrel of another busy season? When is it really happening? Yeah. And so it allows us to go back and look at the cycles of data now, and now we can go to the client beyond just the tactical outreach. We can now sit down with our client and have strategy and say, like, these 3 months of the year are when we're going to hire the most of these type of people. So it's good for us tactically, and it also ends up being really interesting strategically.
So that actually leads to a great question from Levy, and he asks, has your sourcing intake meeting changed over time? I imagine it would have to if, the numbers are changing, the outreach is changing.
Right. I think it will. That's a good question. I think it will. I don't think because it's still new and people don't have a lot of faith in things that are new. We are going to the client now, and we're now able to go to the client and tell them, like, we think, but we don't have years and years and years of data on this, right? This data, a lot of times, as we're constantly adding new pools, so some of these data, we've only been watching them for a few months. So we don't have enough volume of data over enough period of time to really sit down and say this is the way it is. But we are prepping the clients for that conversation.
Yeah. I love this. I love that data first approach, because I think it targets so many of the consistent issues that people talk about, right? Like, you have to send so many emails, look at the funnel, etc. And if you start at the top of actually defining what that is, it works a lot better all the way through, or at least that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I wrote about this kind of at, I think it was my first article, Death to Purple Squirrels, was, or maybe the second one, but what happens, it was inspired because an actual event in my career. We had the COO walk into our recruiting meeting, and some job had been open for like 180 days or some crime against nature like that. And, he was like, there are over 300 million people in this country. I need one. What are you guys doing? And from his point of view, that operations point of view, that made perfect sense, because that's the way operations people do. One hire is 4 interviews, is 8 screens, is 100 resumes. Go find another 100 resumes. What are you doing? But now that from a recruiter's point of view, you're like, that's a lot of hay to find you a needle. And both of those points of view are looking at the same piece of information. But what you do now with mapping out the talent pools is you're like, there aren't really another 100 for us to find. Maybe there are, but it's going to be exceptionally hard to find. Rather than trying to find the next 100, why don't we focus in on getting the people that we've already identified to engage with us? And that helps us as recruiters change the conversation, because whenever we talk to operations people who always end up in charge of recruiting, they always break it down to pure numbers, and we've always kind of had to go along with it. And now with this sort of data, the supply and demand data that's becoming available, not we're using it for something specific, but again, I mentioned, I think Career Builder has a portal now, supply and demand data. You're actually to go out and map out your talent pool and say, look, there really aren't another 150, 250 qualified people we can just easily reach out to. What we really need to do is change the conversation about how we engage with the people we've already identified.
Yeah, and exactly. And something else we talked about is how demand increases that. So you have the supply and demand talent pool, and you know how many people are in it, but how many jobs in ratio to how many people? This could also be a big factor in how often people look and their motivation.
The beautiful thing about working with operations people is they get that, right? Like when we report to operations people and we show them the data and we're like, yeah, but unemployment among college-educated professionals is 2.5% right now. We're in a labor shortage. Not only that, in this specific talent pool, there are 1,500 other job postings for this exact same job and only 300 people available. That's what we're up against. They go, the light bulb goes off for them, right?
They get it.
And then it really truly starts to become this partnership that we all give great lip service to. And the way for it to become a true partnership is we have to add something of value to the conversation. And when you provide data like that to an operations professional, they see the value in it. And we don't have to lead them to water. They'll drink. That's their world. So it's really potentially a way for us to, in actuality, in practice, move from just saying we're business partners to actually having a seat at the table, which is exciting.
Right. All right, so let's move on to the outreach part, because I know there are still a ton of questions about predictive talent pooling, but you guys know how to find Mike. Ask him. Ellie wants to know, so you have a different approach in the first place in identifying those who match. So how does that impact your messaging when you're reaching out? Because you can't be like, I know you're looking. I've been creeping on you.
Right. So, yeah, we don't obviously tip our hand to that. But I think in recruiting, if you've been recruiting long enough, just as a numbers game, you've had those conversations, though, where people are like, how did you know to call today? It's perfect timing. I just get more of those conversations now than I used to because I'm creating my own serendipity.
Yeah.
But I approach them in the exact same way. I personalize. We talk about this. I know Johnny Campbell's talked about that a lot too, like mentioning 2 or 3 unique identifiers. We still do that, right? I see you've been working for General Motors for the last 3 years as the assistant manager, but you got promoted last year from a lead supervisor position. So obviously you're very career-minded. What's the next step for you? Can we have a conversation? We don't change it. Right? We still want to put the unique identifiers into our outreach so they know we're talking to them. And all I'm doing now is instead of sending 100 of those, which I get, that gets tiring. Writing 100 custom emails, I'm a recruiter for God's sakes too. I have the attention span of squirrel, I'm there. So this really helps me to have to only send 10 to get 5 people back instead of sending 50 to get 5 people back. So
and so you're doing all this testing, and you have your score from 4 to 72, and Levy asked, how accurate are you in that 4 to 72 range? Are you seeing, if people are in that range, it's pretty spot on that they're looking?
So, yeah, that's a good question. We do regression testing happens. I don't personally do it, but there is regression testing in the tools, so that we look at 30 days, 60 day, 90 day out. Did the people who it looked like they were moving, did they actually move, and what percentage of them moved? And so we try and keep track of it. That's more like the developers are more on the technical sides of how that works than I am. I know a few of the data points we're looking at. I'm not an
jump in at the last minute. This is why I keep toying.
But yeah, so we look at it for sure in retrograde testing or whatever, and try and see how accurate we were.
Yeah.
Regression testing.
I got a few people chiming in. Thanks for being so down to earth and explaining this in terms that people can understand from Chris. Um, I'm so intrigued by this because I think we have endemic issues in our industry where people are experiencing these consistent challenges. Oh, there's not enough people. We're not getting the response rate, etc. And it sounds, you're using data to actually solve for these. And one thing we started talking about really briefly before we had to go live was how that span. So are you only doing U.S. based roles right now?
No, I actually just started into Canada. So one of our clients at Hudson is GlaxoSmithKline in Canada. So I've actually started mapping out the talent pools there. Hudson is a global RPO, so I imagine at some point we'll start mapping this out in Europe and Asia Pacific as the process gets refined. This is actually something where I'm excited because I had a hand in inventing the process. I didn't invent the technologies, but I was able to combine existing technologies in a way that's allowed us to roll this out at scale. So that was exciting for me. But before we roll it out globally, we're beta test. We're really in a beta, I would say, where we're testing it with some of our existing clients to see that if we really get the increase in response rates and throughput that we're hoping for. I mean, anecdotally, it makes sense that if you talk to people who are more likely to be looking for a job, that more of them will respond to you. But, as I've already discovered with pharmacy salespeople, anecdote doesn't always equate to, data. So we're trying to map that out and get a better idea of it before we really globally deploy it, I think.
Exactly. And, when I was at SHRM this week, I talked to some of their analysts, and they said the one trend they're finding in big data is that it does not scale globally. That when you do have some predictive data on, on a community, let's say, it's not the same if you take it to Europe or take it to Asia. It just doesn't perform the same way.
Yeah, we're looking at, I think the other thing that too is, so we have several different data pools. So I'll look at pharmacy sales across the United States, but then I'll also look at pharmacy sales in Dallas. And those two numbers don't always match up.
Right.
So it's not only a matter of, and I think the like organizations like SHRM are looking at big sets of global data versus I'm looking at digital media planners in Chicago. Right, like I'm looking at this one little ecosystem and trying to figure out what's going on there. And I think I think what you're talking about is accurate because you start to have so many different influences on so many different fields that you really, you really get the butterfly effect, for lack of a better term, right? Like one little fluke in the system somewhere, Greece is about to default on their debt, and then the entire world economy goes nuts, right? Like, it's disproportionate.
Or London's gonna right? All the Brexit combos.
Yes, those sort of things, those sort of outlier events have disproportionate effect on data like that. So that's why I think when you're trying to map out like a global economy, this would be probably useless. But when you're trying to look at pharmacy salespeople in Dallas, that's a lot more effective.
Absolutely. So we have a few people here who are at the job board G8 in Chicago today. And so is there an approach here that could be adopted by, say, a job board community, right? People who are building them or using them?
I mean, yeah, Casey wrote an article about how to monitor your own talent pools. I think he wrote it couple months ago, Casey Donovan, for those of you not familiar with him. You can manually try and do these sort of things. The problem for me is that I have the attention span of a recruiter, and like I just can't go through it every day and sort it out. So I have a tool that automates that process. It is technically doable manually. It's just, to me, it's not it's going to
with
take
that.
so much time to manually monitor it that you're going to lose the efficiency you gain by learning who's going to respond to you.
Yeah. So seriously, time flies when you're nerding out on recruiting because we have 3 minutes left.
Oh
So
boy.
I want to talk just a little bit about what you see as the future of sourcing. What are some things that people should be training up and learning about now so that they're prepared to be effective?
Right. Good question. So I think we're going to there's three paths that are happening to sourcing. One is the data side, right? We're really going to have more researchers, I think they'll be called in the future. And those are the people and the tools, things like Hiring Solve that'll go out and find your phone numbers and email addresses, right? Just the raw data about who's who. Then you'll have sourcers, then you'll have employer branding. Employer branding is, more about talent attraction and increasing awareness of certain employer brands in specific markets. So most people know who L'Oreal is, but very few people know, like one of our clients will be Starcom. If you walk down the street, very few people would know that. And you wouldn't care as a consumer for most people to know that, but you would want digital media planners in Chicago to know who Starcom is.
Right.
So I think you'll see more employer branding focused around specific markets and targets. You'll find more marketing language working its way into sourcing. I think we'll stop hearing sourcers and recruiters. It's been a conversation that's going on forever now. And it's going to be inbound recruiting and outbound recruiting, I think is the way we're going to go. And outbound recruiters, which are called sourcers now, I think they're going to turn into full life cycle recruiters for outbound sourced candidates. I think we're going to start walking people through the entire process. It just makes sense. The less handoffs you have, the more smooth the process works. In our team, we're already integrating upstream. So my sourcers, they now, a lot of them submit directly to hiring managers.
Yep.
Improve our efficiency as a sourcing team. And we are responsible specifically and only for the outbound recruiting.
Yep.
So I think that'll be the new division. Recruiters will be divided into outbound recruiters and inbound recruiters. And I think that'll be the difference moving forward.
Well, and I think all those efficiencies that you're talking about make that possible, right? I'm telling you, she just wants to be famous. This is Lyric.
Hi, Lyric.
All right. Well, on that note, we just hit time. Seriously,
all right.
This Recruiting Live always flies because we're talking about such cool stuff. So next week we have sourcer extraordinaire David Nicola, and I will actually have him explain to me how to say his last name because I'm pretty sure I've been butchering it for about 6 weeks now. And we're going to talk his sourcing strategies. Mike, thank you so much. This was really interesting, and I feel like everyone on the call really enjoyed it. And we're getting a ton of thank yous. I'll be sure to send all their info your way. And if you want to find Mike, he's Mike Wolford. Look for the guy with the purple squirrel giving him a kiss. That hand is Levy, apparently. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. And everyone who's on still, you can register for next week on recruitingtools.com. If you're already registered, though, you're already set for next week, and you'll get the reminder. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.